So as I described, I went my whole life being a communist leftist. Then in like 2014, I became a right winger, uh, and I became a communist leftist again. But as I described too, in that time period, like 2014, 2015, my grandpa stopped talking to me because we got in an argument. So I wrote that based on a true story book. And in that book, when I was a leftist again, I was talking down about right wingers, and I was talking about how like I felt that my mom's mistreatment of me was because she misinterpreted I thought that my grandpa was a right winger, and I thought that, her lack of compassion for me was due to her, being brainwashed by that like right wing ideology of like not caring and not having sympathy, because my mom was like, yeah, poor people should just get a job. And she thought that she was doing what my grandpa would teach, because my grandpa would kind of teach that a little bit. But at the same time, my grandpa told me later that when my mom would say that, she had predator prey software. She was expressing predator prey software, and she's not in the flow, and she was judgmental. So, the way that she would talk. But I felt that my mom misinterpreted my grandpa's teachings, like, you need to take responsibility. My grandpa was like, yeah, take responsibility for everything, that's good. But he thought that my mom again had expressed dualistic software, like predator prey software, to me. They'll take responsibility, judgmental consciousness, where as my grandpa would be like, well, it is true to taking responsibility is beneficial, for your software. But but again, my grandpa would say that my mom misinterpreted all his teachings, right? But at the same time, like when I wrote my book, I was trying to say that she didn't misinterpret his teachings, and his teachings lead to to lead you to being a right winger. And I felt that's what happened to me when I started to kind of like ingest and assimilate his teachings. I feel like I became more of a right winger, you know. But I'll get more into that later. But so I wrote that based on a true story book, and it was a leftist communist book again, because I became a leftist communist again. But I tried to, use my grandpa's teachings, like transcend the self and the flow and stuff like that. But I still went back to my default, and I still maintained that leftist ideology. But I went back to, because I saw myself as Jewish and I was anti-white and I was leftist communist. So then, as I said, my grandpa started to teach me these things though, and he started teaching me like, that Jesus was not for giving to the poor, because that's one of the temptations, to turn stone to bread. And that was a social welfare gospel. And my grandpa talked about like, Jesus, people give because they think that, then they'll be superior, or, also that slave mentality, like, oh, the poor are the superior ones. But my grandpa said that's not what Jesus taught. Jesus taught to transcend the self. And I didn't realize that, my leftist ideology at that time, now it's clear to me, but it's because I saw myself as Jewish and I was anti-white, and I wanted to destroy the white race, kind of, And that's why I was so into like open borders, and, I wanted race mixing. My whole life I was very into race mixing. I liked it. And, so, but then and my grandpa would say, race mixing isn't necessarily bad, but it depends on your software. It depends on your motivation for it, right? And my motivation was to defeat white people, right? But at this time, though, I mean, it's like 2016. That's when I started becoming a right winger again, and I'll get more into details about that transition. But again, I went from left wing to right wing. But I remember though, this was about the time when my grandpa and I. Well, I'll just give like one more example about that. Like I remember I went to a Hare Krishna temple at that time. And I didn't like Hare Krishna because it was a religion. And I saw all religion as white supremacists. And I saw Hinduism as white supremacists. And I thought that religion maintained division and borders, like India versus, the Arabs, or India versus Pakistan, or, and I wanted all the people to mix, the Arabs to mix with the Indians, to mix with the white people. And because I wanted to defeat the white people mainly. And I saw, Hinduism as just another subterfuge for maintaining division. And, I was a communist leftist, so I wanted no division. I wanted mixing. So, and I didn't like Hare Krishna, because and also, Hare Krishna, they're very into like, good guy, bad guy, like, punishing bad people, and, legislating morality, making sure women don't have sex, outside of marriage and stuff. And remember, I was a leftist and I was a communist, and I wanted race mixing, and I wanted the white people to be dissolved. And I always saw the people who were like, anti-women freedom and anti-feminist as white supremacists, right? And I wanted basically to destroy the white race, because I think, I saw them as bad as a leftist, right? That's the way I saw it. So, But I remember when I was with the Hare Krishna, I remember the Hare Krishna would teach like a vegetarian was very good. And I had studied the book Ishmael, which said that the Jews were nomads and that they were sheep herders, and they ate meat. They were pastoralists, kind of like the Shiva worshipping Dravidians. And the Indo-European people came and they conquered them. And the Indo-European people were agriculturalists and they tended more to be vegetarian. And that's what the thesis was with the conquering by the Aryans of the Dravidians in India. And so I was like, okay, well, vegetarian is actually evil. It's white supremacist, because it was the white supremacist agriculturalists, Aryans, who conquered the Dravidians, who were pastoralists and who ate meat and made them eat meat. So like I wanted to see eating meat is good, and to see but basically I just wanted to destroy Hare Krishna. I wanted to destroy every religion. I wanted to destroy Christianity. I wanted to undermine it all and subvert it all. And so I was kind of like, what do they call it? Like a biblical criticist, right? And just a religious criticist in general. And because I wanted to dissolve it all. And just like one example, just to make it clear, like that I would study a lot later. Like I remember I was studying the story of Krishna. And one of the theories about why Krishna would steal the butter was, well, the butter would go to the king for taxes, and Krishna wanted to destroy the king. And I was like, yeah, I like that idea, because again, it was like anti-white supremacist, anti-society, like, yeah, anti the white people who control, like the king. And, and Krishna eats the butter, and because he's trying to defeat he's not conservative. He's trying to defeat the system. He's trying to destroy the system. And because I was for race mixing and destroying the system, and I was a communist leftist. I was a Marxist. But then the other theory was, well, the butter represents the soul and, transcending the self kind of thing. And that's the way that when I asked my grandpa, well, do you think that that's more accurate? And my grandpa was like, yeah, that's more accurate. But now I understand what it means. But when, at the time, like, I didn't understand, like, necessarily what that means to transcend the self. But, I was like, yeah, again, that's just a religious interpretation, and an interpretation that wants to maintain the status quo and maintain the order. I didn't like Hinduism because it was like, oh yeah, well, the reason why you guys are poor is because you guys you lived a bad life last life, so it justified the status quo. And I was a Marxist. I wanted to destroy the status quo, and I was anti-white. So, but my grandpa would be more into a spiritual interpretation, like, oh yeah, the butter represents the self, and Jesus, Krishna is eating the self, or because the butter was actually made of ghee, and the ghee represents the soul, or stuff like that. So when I became more religious and I was right winger, I liked those interpretations better than the Marxist interpretations. But I noticed that the people of color would more like the Marxist interpretations, right? So, but regardless, in 2016, I went back to being like a right winger kind of white supremacist again, and I started listening to my grandpa. Like, my grandpa's talking about, I don't know. I just went back. I went from being a leftist, and my grandpa kind of influenced me in that way. But then again, my grandpa and I got in another argument because my grandpa was trying to make me I was trying to tell my grandpa, can you help me to talk to my mom and dad? And my grandpa was like, well, if you're in the flow, you're not attached. And I always got the impression that my grandpa didn't respect me because he didn't believe the quadrant model. Of course he doesn't respect me. He doesn't believe the quadrant model. I discovered theory of everything, but he doesn't believe it. So he looks down upon me, and he, of course, he doesn't want me to see my mom and dad because he thinks I'm crazy. So, and I always got that impression, and I'm not stupid. And like, it's kind of clear to me. So like, he was like, well, if you're in the flow, you're not attached to your parents. You're not attached to anybody. And he was trying to make it so that my parents would stop giving me money, and he wanted to make me completely independent and make me get a job and stuff, right? So my grandpa was like, yeah, if you're in the flow, you're not attached to anybody, and also, you would have a job, because when you have a job, you're a part of the hero's journey, and the person who's working, you continue to expand your awareness and expand your consciousness, and you can be a part of the hero's journey, and you grow. He was using Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and then you grow and you learn, and you work your way up in your job, and that's a part of the hero's journey, and that's a part of your expansion. And being lazy and is just self-confirmatory. He didn't know I was not lazy. I was working on the quadrant model. I was working my ass off, But, and then he was like, and if you're in the flow, you're not attached to anything. You're not attached to your parents. And he was trying to get my parents to not give me money. And my grandpa was like, and I was like, well, don't you think that you should give your own family money? Like, give your son money. And my grandpa was like, not necessarily. If you're in the flow, you're one with everybody. Nobody is really your family. Everybody's your family. There is no thing. And And I was like, and again, I thought I saw him kind of as a white supremacist because like, yeah, you just have to work. You have to work hard. Everything is work hard, and you take responsibility and don't take any handouts. Don't take any handouts. And I was like, that's just the white supremacist type of ideology. But in his mind, it's like, no, that's not the way that I am. I just, that's just the flow, just working hard and being a part of synergy. And I'll get more into that later. But so we got another argument. And I was like, it's these ideologies that you keep teaching. This is what you feed to my mom and dad, and it ends up and they interpret it as, oh yeah, let's not talk to Ryan, let's throw him out of our lives, let's neglect him, let's dismiss him, and let's So they hadn't talked to me for years, and I wanted to talk to them, and I wanted to see them. So yeah, so but like another thing that my grandpa taught that kind of moved me more to a right winger, right? Like I remember like I went to a rabbi's thing, and the rabbi, he was Orthodox rabbi, and the Orthodox tend to be more white supremacists, like they're more religious, right? But the Orthodox rabbi was saying that King David said that the poor, that he would rather be poor or something, and that the poor, he'd rather be poor and eat vegetables, or and eat vegetables than be with the rich and eat meat or something like that. And my grandpa was like, but I asked my grandpa, are the poor superior? Because as a leftist, I wanted to see it that way. I was anti-white and I wanted to see it that way. But then my grandpa's like, no, the poor aren't necessarily superior, and then so I asked him, well, what about that story of the rich young ruler? The rich ruler, he ended up going to hell in the Gospels, but the poor man Lazarus, he ended up going to heaven, or he ended up going to Abraham's bosom or something. So I'm like, well, that seems to be like communist. It seems to be like for the poor. And then my grandpa's like, no, it's not for the poor. My grandpa's saying, just because you're poor doesn't mean that you have, you've upgraded your software, that you have a higher level of consciousness. Now, when I was a communist, I wanted to believe that the Bible was written by Canaanite serfs, and it wasn't written, I did the intellectual, the way that the scholars looked at the Bible, that, the Bible wasn't real, it's mythology and legendary. And it really comes from Canaanite serfs, so it was brown people, and it's anti-white. I wanted an anti-white communist interpretation of the Bible, right? And I wanted to destroy religion because I saw religion as white supremacist. So, I wanted to believe that, the Bible was communist because it was written by the descendants of communist serfs. So I wanted to be like, yeah, see, the Bible says, the poor Lazarus, he ends up going to heaven, but the rich ruler, he ends up not. And my grandpa was like, well, it is possible that because the man was rich, maybe he settled more and he didn't continue to expand his consciousness and expand his awareness. And, he didn't have any impetus to continue to grow. But, the poor guy, he could have been poor because he was studying and he was continuing to grow and he was continuing to leverage his assets and continuing to expand and all that stuff. So he ends up going to heaven. And it's the idea that he transcended his body more. He transcended the self more, whereas the rich one didn't. But my grandpa would be like, but that's not necessarily always the case. And just because you're rich, it doesn't mean you're bad. So he's an existentialist, kind of like Nietzsche. And that's what Nietzsche taught, that the Bible was slave mentality. But my grandpa was like, no, the Bible's not slave mentality. Jesus really, he had transcendental consciousness, and he didn't teach that the poor is better. He taught the transcendence of the ego, transcendence of the self. So he's teaching me this stuff. And before I went to back being a communist, but now he's teaching me this stuff. And I'm starting to think, and I started becoming more right wing again. So I stopped being anti-white, anti-rich, and I started being more, but I went back to being more pro-white because I didn't understand really the transcendence of the self. So I went to be more pro-white and more white supremacist again. So I became a right winger again. And I remember like when Trump was running, I liked Trump a lot, and I basically became a white supremacist again. And I started to believe again, like, there's a race mixing agenda and stuff. I started to understand, like, to look down upon the black, the people of color a little bit more and feel bad for white people more. Right. And so I became more pro-white again. I became right wing or more nationalist pro-white, as opposed to what I was before, a leftist, communist, anti-white. So, and there's a big part because of my grandpa's teaching. She was teaching me these things like that the Bible wasn't communistic, that it's not communistic. And he was giving me these ideas. Like one other thing that I remember that I asked my grandpa at that time was, I went to this Mother Goddess church, and it had a lot of Mexicans there and black people and stuff. And it was kind of like anti-religion, right? Because they even though they were religious, right, they were worshiping the goddess. And they believe the goddess was Christ Ansang Hong's wife, and he's some Korean guy. And so they're kind of like lampooning religion, right? And probably because it was the same thing as me, right? I didn't like religion because I wanted to destroy religion, and they were like that too, and they're Mexicans and people of color, right? And they probably saw religion as white supremacists too. So they wanted to destroy it too. So I was going to that thing. But I remember one of the things they taught was that they said, well, Jesus said, do not follow, or, it says in the Bible, do not follow vain philosophies. And I thought to myself, well, is my grandpa teaching a vain philosophy? And my grandpa was like, no, a vain philosophy is Christianity. But so that was when he taught me that was what was making me more, that was when I was a leftist. And I was like, oh yeah, Christianity is a vain philosophy. So I wrote that in my leftist book. Remember my first based on true story book when I tried to be a leftist and I tried to destroy religion. So you're like, yeah, Christianity is the vain philosophy. And I'll get more into what I did to try to destroy religion back then when I was leftist. But then when my grandpa's teaching me this stuff, the right wing stuff, like, no, the Bible's not against the poor. And, and like, I remember when I went to the Hare Krishna place, like I said, I wanted to see the Aryan agriculturalist vegetarians as really the evil ones, and the Dravidian darker races as the good ones. And the Aryans apparently were like the demigods, and the Dravidians were more the demons in their mythology, according to scholars. So that's the way that I wanted to see it. And so I wanted to believe that, like, the nomads were the good ones, right? The nomadic sheep herders, the pastoralists, and the agriculturalists, white people, were the bad ones. So I was, like for the African nomads, they're the good ones, right? The tribal people, they're the real good ones. They're the ones connected with nature. It's kind of like Avatar, the movie Avatar, right? That's the way I wanted to see it, and the evil white people, right? But then I started to kind of switch it, and I was just like, because my grandpa was like, no, God is energy, and God is the evolutionary configuration of reality, like the evolutionary movement of reality. And a part of that evolution is moving from, one level to the, moving from like the nomadic level to the pastoralist to the agriculturalist. And yes, the agriculturalist did kill the pastoralist. But my grandpa was like, well, this was one thing my grandpa taught me. He said, it says that when Cain killed Abel, Cain says, is this my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper? And then God doesn't say no. And then God actually puts a mark on his forehead and protects him. So my grandpa was like, see, so I was like, well, isn't Cain the bad guy? And my grandpa was like, no, Cain is not his brother's keeper. God never said he's his brother's keeper. So again, I thought that this was like right wing, and like, oh, so you don't want to help your brother, you don't want to give to the poor, you don't want like social welfare and stuff. But my grandpa's like, no, working's important, and no, you're not your brother's keeper. My grandpa said you're your brother's brother, and giving to your brother doesn't necessarily help your brother. It could, but not necessarily. You have to be in the flow to really know. And if you're not in the flow, giving can actually backfire. Now, when I was a leftist, I'll get to that later. But when I was a leftist, like, okay, I'll get to that later. But yeah, but my grandpa's teaching me this stuff, and I'm starting to become a right winger again. So my grandpa, I think that he influenced me to become a right winger more again. But so I went back I went my whole life being a leftist, communist, anti-white, for a little bit in 2014, becoming a right winger, white supremacist, then going back to being a left winger communist, because I thought that my grandpa was a left winger communist. But then I started realizing my grandpa's a right winger. And also, and he starts teaching me the ways of looking at the Bible that are more right wing, and I went back to being a right winger and being pro white again. And so this is like 2016 time when I'm pro white again, and I'm more of a right winger. So I'll get more into this later.